Good morning from Bogota. Good afternoon for those watching us on the East Coast, and particularly in Toronto and in Washington and New York. Sorry for getting started late. We're just working out some technical issues, but we're pleased that you're here and we're pleased that you're staying with us. We're here in the offices of Portafolio newspaper in Bogota, Colombia's leading business journal. And with me to discuss the elections are Adriana Mejía, who is the currently director of the Institute of Political Science, which is Colombia's leading think tank, Poli Martinez, who is a writer and correspondent for Semana Magazine, an ABC newspaper in España, Ricardo Avila, who's generously offered and is hosting this event for us, who is the editor-in-chief of Portafolio, and joining also by Pedro Vargas, who's also an editor at Portafolio, and we understand that we will have to excuse Ricardo at some point during this event because he has a pending meeting in the next several minutes with presidential candidate Iván Duque. So if he leaves, that's the reason why he's leaving, not because he didn't like anything that we were saying. With that, we'd like to get started. Again, thank you for being here. We thought the best way of getting started maybe was just to talk a little bit about how we got to this situation. The internal primaries, party primaries that happened in March, the consultas that inter-party happened at that point, and the intra-party that happened before that, so that we have a base of facts and understandings going forward. And I'd like to ask Adriana if she could please talk a little bit about how we got to this point.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. I would mention one characteristic of this electoral process is that it has been very long. The campaign, I think, has been running for at least the last year. And in the beginning, we counted approximately 29 candidates, which have been very slowly narrowing down. But in the beginning, there were that many, and I think that's a first in Colombian politics. Not so many people were aspiring to the presidency in previous electoral processes. As you mentioned, there were some internal consultations. The first one to hold it was the Liberal Party in November last year. There was a lot of criticism around that primary because, first, it didn't correspond to any specific date in electoral process, and also it was very costly. The turndown was very small. There were, I don't remember exactly how many people went out to vote, but less than 1 million. And I think that harmed the candidate Humberto de la Calle, who was the winner of that first consultation. Then in March, there were internal consultations of two alliances, the Alliance for the Colombia Humana, which was won by Gustavo Petro, and another internal consultation between Centro Democrático and two independent candidates that turned out as a winner, Iván Duque. And that's really when the final scenario was clear. So those candidates that resulted from the March consultation were the ones that went to the first round, and the results were the ones who passed to the second round were Iván Duque and Gustavo Petro.
Thank you. Adriana, in that first round voting, there were 5 principal candidates, as you mentioned. And you mentioned that Iván Duque and Gustavo Petro are advancing to the second round. The candidate who came in third place barely missed out, coming in second place. Sergio Fajardo, the former mayor of Medellin and governor of the state of Antioquia, one of Colombia's largest. And I was wondering, Poli, maybe if you could talk a little bit about the phenomenon of Sergio Fajardo, what he represented, you think, in the first round, and how the electorate responded to what his message was.
Good morning. I think that Fajardo represents the center and the independent vote, the opinion vote. So it was part of the way he structured his own campaign. It was a surprise. He came so close to getting the second place, because at the beginning of the campaign, he was high in the options, or at least at the polls. And then he came down, really down, after the March election and the internal elections of candidates. And then he woke up again and he came back up. And it was amazing how this like a kind of roller coaster thing for Fajardo. And many of the centrist people that are not identified with Petro, the left-handed, or with Duque, considered a right-handed candidate, went after Fajardo. So it was really amazing for the country to know that so many people were interested. He got like 4.5 million votes. And those votes are now lingering, waiting to see to whom are they going to, if to Petro or Duque. So he ended up being like a successful candidate because having such a power. He comes from a coalition also of the Green Party and some of the leftist party, and he represents the center. So it was a surprise for everyone. I think for himself. Right now, I think he's a better politician after...
Excuse us, we're having a visit by Colombia's most famous soccer fanatic, who is putting on a presentation here.
But it was surprising because at the end he has such a huge amount of people backing him, and nobody knows what he's going to do now. He's not going into politics anymore, but now we have that lecture of how the country is divided. It's just not between left and right, but now we have like a center.
Well, thank you, Polly. That's an interesting phenomenon because he outpolled the polling, the predictions by 8 to 10 points. Yes. So he was essentially the surprise, at least from the pollster's standpoint, in the first round. And maybe I would ask you, Ricardo, why did the pollsters have it so wrong? Because the other candidates were more or less accurate within the margin of error, but Fajardo they were off by a lot. Was it an underestimation of the strength of the political middle of the country, or was it the strength of the clean government, the new way of doing politics, the against the political vitriol that he stood for? What made that surge to him at the end, and what do you think that represents and says about the Colombian political situation at the moment?
No, basically what happened to Fajardo is that he represented a cry from the center of the political spectrum, and that's why he got so many votes, and actually it was so close at the end. I would say that pollsters got it right. If you take a look at the polls just before the election, according to Colombian law, no polls can be published 1 week before the election. But if you take a look at the polls that were published 1 week before the election, you could already see that Fajardo was growing. So in that sense, there was no surprise. These waves are usual in politics, and experts say that had the elections lasted 1 more week, probably Fajardo would have won. And actually, if Fajardo had won, probably he would have he would be the favorite in the second round. But again, nothing like that happened, and sort of the center that was behind Fajardo felt orphan, and because of that, there's a very interesting process now, because of course whoever grabs most of the votes that belong to Fajardo, of course, will win the presidency. For Duque, he needs 12 percentage points, or actually 11 percentage points, on top of the 39 he got in the first round. The problem for Petro is that he needs to double his percentage, because he got 25% of the vote, so he would need another 25. Not even with Fajardo's votes. If all of Fajardo's votes went for him, he would have more than 50%. So that's why his chances are slimmer than Duque's.
Well, what's interesting about it is the common narrative now in analyzing Colombian politics is that the country is deeply divided. There's a huge political schism between the left and the right, and we'll talk a little bit about that with the two remaining candidates. But in fact, as Ricardo just said, if Sergio Fajardo, if the campaign had gone on maybe a week longer, because Fajardo was trending, he very well may have won and may have been even or better than even money chance of winning the second round. So it seems that there's two different conflicting narratives about the status of Colombian politics now. One says deeply divided country, but except for 250,000 votes in the first round, people would say, well, maybe not so deeply divided, and there's a grand center to Colombian politics that, and it looks a little bit different than just the quote extreme right versus the extreme left. Do you have any thoughts about the power of the center in Colombia now? And if in fact Fajardo had gone around, what would be, we might be talking about this in a very different way, no?
Yes, he was supposed to win the second round if he had a chance against Iván Duque, but he didn't make it. So the point is, nobody knows what to do with the center. Everybody wants to be at the center. Vargas Lleras, who was supposed to be a good candidate, he missed it because he never got to the center. And Petro and Iván Duque are moving to the center to catch those voters. But the point is that politics, as we had them before, I think they're not coming back. The main political parties, the Liberal Party was Humberto de la Calle. He had a huge, how you call it? Failure, that's right. But at the Congress, the Liberal Party was very successful. So you have to have Congress in mind, talking about politics in Colombia. And if you see Congress, then you would take a look like at the center. You have a right-wing parties that would support Iván Duque, but the Liberal Party that was supposed to support Humberto de la Calle didn't go out, so didn't move the voters. So it's very difficult. I don't think nobody knows really how things are going to shuffle and come out after the election.
And thank you. Following up on that, when you say, Paulie, that politics aren't the same as they used to be, that there's, you think this has been a change event, as it were, in Colombian politics. Is that because you think there is a greater center that's at least being recognized right now? And is it just around the form of doing government, or is it also the center around specific issues? Because if we situate Petro on the left of it, and some of what he's proposing, and again we'll get to that in a couple of minutes, more fundamental changes perhaps, and on the right with Iván Duque, which is no necessarily fundamental changes, but moderate right changes that one might imagine, someone of that ilk might propose. Are we looking at a center that's not just for political civility, but also for positions that are more centrist? Is it centered on both the form of politics and the substance of politics?
Well, I would say it depends on how you define the center. I think most of the candidates that went to the first round agreed basically on some fundamentals regarding the model of government and the handling of the economy. Most are pro-free market with different degrees of intervention of the state. That would be correct for Iván Duque, Hernán Vargas Lleras, Humberto de la Calle, and Sergio Fajardo. Petro has, on the contrary, shown a very big appetite for state intervention and for state regulation of certain economic activities. So if you call the center a more open market, free enterprise model, well, the majority of the candidates were in that center. I think the discussion, and we were talking about it a few minutes ago, is not so much between the left and the right, but rather whether the current institutional architecture should be maintained with some adjustments, of course, or rather to fully change the model and start from zero.
Yeah.
And I think the discussion is more around that, and I think that most of the Colombian voters would prefer to maintain, the current institutional architecture and the economic development model based on free enterprise. However, there is so much also anger because of corruption. The system is perceived as being very corrupt, that people are willing to vote, and those, I think, are most of Petro voters, for something that they imagine is going to be completely new, because they're sick and tired of what they perceive like the same old that we've had for the past 50 years.
Yeah. Well, to continue smashing the conventional wisdom about Colombian politics, Ricardo, one could imagine there are names, in Colombia of left-wing candidates, to use that classification, who might have well won this election. Antonio Navarro Wolf, for example, his name comes up often as a guy who may have been appealed much more to the center, or even this, I'll just say the center vote, than perhaps Petro is doing at this point, and may have made this an even a closer race than at this point it appears to be, with a gap of at least 10%, 15% between the candidates. So, to follow the iconoclastic view, is Colombia really as conservative politically as it's made out to be?
Well, the explanation is that we are entering a new phase because of the peace process with the FARC. And when the FARC was a guerrilla group, basically that made it impossible for the left in Colombia to have a real shot of at power, because of course that made the country more leaning more towards the center right than towards the center left, although in our past we have had center left presidents. Alfonso López or Virgilio Barco are two examples of the center left. But now, of course, the difference is that without the FARC, the left has a real chance, and this is the first time in Colombian history that a leftist candidate that is more left than center has a real chance of being the president. I believe that you have to, in that sense, give credit to Gustavo Petro, who is an extraordinary campaigner. I mean, Petro with a microphone has an ability that no one in the rest of the field of these 5 candidates that went to the first round surpasses. So his abilities, his verbal abilities are so incredible that actually he overcame his image after he left the office of the mayor of Bogota after a very, very poor performance as mayor. Petro demonstrated that he is a very bad administrator, but nonetheless, he has been able to convince the voters that he is sort of a different Petro, a more moderate for the second round, that he has received the support of people who are saying, listen, yes, that was the first Gustavo Petro, yes, had some problems, but the second Gustavo Petro has gone through a process of reform, and he will deliver, and because of that, he has a real chance of being Colombia's president for the next 4 years. And if not, of course, people know that he has an even bigger chance of being Colombia's president in 2022.
Yeah. it's interesting you mentioned the political space that's been created for the left in the wake of the signing of the peace agreement with the FARC. And only a year ago, perhaps, many of the analysts, I wasn't one of them, I don't think anybody here was, but many of them were saying one of the big issues in this campaign was going to be the FARC peace agreement. In fact, it really didn't seem to turn out to be. It was an issue that came up. Of the 4 out of the 5 major candidates in the second round, 4 of them were staunch supporters of the peace agreement. Mr. Duque being the one exception, who polled 39%. Does that at least tell us that Colombia is ready to turn the page on accepting the peace agreement as it is now? Again, I understand that candidate Duque wants to make some changes, and we'll get to that in a second as well. But is that a new phase also? Candidates being evaluated not just who can have the hard hand or the mano duro in dealing with conflict, but dealing about all the other issues that matter to people on their day-to-day lives? Or is that a bit of a transition Colombia has really solidified at this point?
That's a good question. Somebody said a week ago, and I was talking with someone, and he said, you know what, we're going to hand on the baby. And let's see how are they going to deal with the baby. The baby has to eat, the peace process has to eat, the baby has stomach problems, the baby exists. So yes, let's give them the baby and see what happens. So if Iván Duque wins, he will receive the peace process as it is. And I don't think there's an issue around peace within itself, but that we really don't know how to deal with that. It's not been a successful implementation process, and that's part of the problems. And when you say turn the page, I think we're not all on the same page. I've talked that with you. So that's the problem. When we're all on the same page, maybe we can turn it. But right now, I don't think so. And the way Iván Duque has approached the issue hasn't been that nice or successful. You have to have in mind the rest of the country. And those places that have been more affected by violence and war are the ones who are supporting Petro. So Iván Duque has to listen to almost 10 million people who are saying, we don't agree in the way you're talking about the peace process. We need some changes. What are you going to do about it? So if he wins, he'll receive a baby.
And thank you, and isn't it fair to say, Adriana, he may say, well, I received a sick baby, and I didn't like this baby to begin with, but at the end of the day, Colombians are going to judge him on how well he implements his peace agreement. I mean, are there any excuses that he would have in 4 years' time if the implementation doesn't go well to say, well, it really wasn't my problem, I did the best I could? Will Colombians accept that kind of an explanation, or will that turn them not even further, but in 4 years' time, make them particularly upset with, let's say, the right wing of the Colombian political spectrum?
I don't think he's going to kill the baby. I think he's...
Not on purpose.
No. I think that he's very much aware that he needs to be open to listening to the other half of the country. I think both candidates should share that awareness and that consciousness that whichever of them wins, they have to hold a very open and public discussion to see how they can build and be more constructive than what we have been as a country in the last year and a half. I think many adjustments that have been made to the agreement have already been processed through our institutional channels. The Congress has intervened, the Constitutional Court has intervened, and there is still a very big space to continue to make adjustments via the institutional channels that we have today. An example of that, which we are seeing evolve, is the situation of the extradition of one of the FARC leaders that was put forward by the U.S. government. And we have basically the Attorney General, the Constitutional Court, and the Special Jurisdiction for Peace holding a discussion as to who is competent to define on this extradition. So that kind of process takes place independent of who is president. Now, the incoming president can ask for some adjustments, which in any way will have to be discussed in Congress and will have to be validated by the courts. So I think the baby has many caretakers involved.
Godmothers and fathers.
And it's not a unilateral decision like the president is going to be the sole responsible person of whatever outcome. Having said that, I also
Unless
think...
it's successful, then the president will take credit for it.
That's right.
Well, yeah, probably. But the other thing I think that we must deal with is that the implementation process is very complex. I mean, the agreement was extremely ambitious in its breadth, and I think not very many people were so conscious that it would be so difficult. Now, people are more aware, and well, hopefully those difficulties are being overcome, but it's not something that you can do from one day to the other.
Thank you. Maybe we should turn at this point a little bit to some of the differences in the candidates' platforms, and particularly want to move to the economic platform right away. Ricardo, hopefully to make good use of your time before you might have to leave, could you explain a little bit of the differences in the economic platform between candidate Petro and candidate Duque?
Well, we have to talk now about candidate Petro in the second round, because he is a softer Petro 2.0, because he is a softer version of the Gustavo Petro that we heard in the first round. But he is, to define him, he's basically a populist. I was at a small town outside of Bogota during the weekend, and there was this motorbike with speakers saying, "Vote for Gustavo Petro, who will give you free education, free health, access to university, and so on and so forth."
So he's basically turning it into Sweden, basically.
Exactly, right. Exactly. So probably he has magical powers, but that's...
But with better music.
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, but at the same time, he is pro state intervention, and he sort of the two main areas where he would be noticed would be, first, the pension system, and second, the health system, because he would get rid of the semi-insurance companies that we have here, and that are intermediaries between the public and the hospitals. We have a health system that is basically broke, but at the same time has a coverage of 96-97%, one of the most successful in the world. At the same time, he has promised that he will give access to credit, and that he will follow more or less the Brazilian example in terms of with the BNDES, in terms of providing access to credit to people who basically have to go through informal channels and pay absurd interest rates, what we call here the daily pay or the paga diario. And these would be basically his three main areas. Of course, the big question is, would he follow the fiscal rule that we have in place, or would he, what about tax reform? And he has said that he would tax, of course, wealthier Colombians, that he would reintroduce state tax, that he would increase marginal rates, but of course he never says, of course, if he basically will aim for a balanced budget or things like that. In that sense, Duque is much more predictable, although he has shown also some populist strains, and basically he has promised that he will increase salaries and lower taxes, especially for enterprises. And again, given the tight fiscal situation in Colombia, the question is that possible, and I believe, and most experts believe that actually he will have to actually renege of, go back against this word and actually present a tax reform before Congress sooner than later, because otherwise he will have no money to pursue his agenda.
Well, one of the issues that came up was the issue of obviously closing the social and economic gap. And thank you, Ricardo. Thank you. Closing the social and the economic gap in Colombia. And given, as Ricardo talked about, the tight fiscal situation in Colombia, is it possible will there be enough money to advance education, which is a big platform for both candidates, to engage in some of the other social betterment programs that they're talking about? Is there any money to do that?
Well, it depends. Colombia has been dependent on commodities for a very long time, and the industrial base has contracted. One of the main challenges is to diversify the economy and have many more sources of income than what we currently have. And in order to do that, it's important to attract a private investment, both national and foreign, where stability and rules are key. So I'm saying if that sort of framework is put in place, you would see economy growing at 4.5%, which had been the average for the last years when we had the oil prices boom. It depends on the health of the macroeconomic fundamentals, and also I think the fact that investors can believe in the project and have that trust that if they bring in their money, it's going to be well taken care of.
I can think of no other marked difference than from a Canadian investor standpoint than the view of mining and oil and gas, natural resources, where it seems to me there's the sharpest difference. Duque believing in the importance of the mining sector and oil and gas. He talks about it being socially responsible, and even very open to considering fracking as well. And pretty much on all those three issues, you would have candidate Petro on the other side of it, saying wanted to wean self off of it, and then the agricultural and putting more emphasis on agriculture being essentially the great economic engine going forward, at least in his administration. I'm getting a sign that we have to. Pedro, are we needing to finish up? Yeah. So anyway, with that, I'd like to thank both of you. I'd like to thank Ricardo in absentia at this point, but very much for his contributions. And we hope to convene something like this, not in the too distant future, to give a report card on where the new president, how he has delivered, and what may be some of his challenges going forward. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, Poli. Thank you, Adriana.